Hi, I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. An absolute pleasure to be able to speak to you. How are you doing today, Marilyn?
I'm good, Sarah. A pleasure for me as well. Thank you.
So maybe we could just kick off with a brief introduction to your wonderful, fascinating documentary. What can people expect when they tune in?
Well, this is a documentary about the early years and really the origin story of Sesame Street. And one of the things that makes me so excited about this film is that it really talks about and shows the roots of this story. It's really about this little band of performers and artists and writers and musicians and educators who were really a group of activists and set out to do something that was going to change the face of television and certainly the face of children's television, coming out of the civil rights movement. I think there are a lot of things about the origin that people don't know, and I'm so pleased to have this film out and so happy that it's coming to the UK.
And, I think like many other people, just watching the documentary, I sort of had this, the flooding feeling of nostalgia, because I remember it vividly from when I was a kid, but actually didn't obviously think that much about what was behind it, how it was put together. And I know, generations of kids and, adults today still remember it. So what was your way into the show? Was it something you grew up loving to watch? And why did you decide it was so important to make a documentary about it right now?
Well, yes, I've known Sesame Street virtually my whole life. And I had never seen anything like it before. There had never been anything like it before. It really, prior to this show, most children's programming was in a fairy castle or a, circus tent with clowns. And the purpose of these shows primarily was to sell products to kids, to sell toys and candy and, breakfast cereals. And Sesame Street comes along looking so different than everything else. It was set on a street, a set that was meant to look like a street in Harlem. It had a mixed race cast, the first time this had ever been seen on American television. Black people, white people, Hispanic people, monsters, Muppets, all living together. They never talk about it. They just are. And everything about it is just so new, especially then. And the show was really saying some very profound things about social justice, about the world, but it was wrapped up in such an entertaining package. I mean, the Muppets are hysterical. The comedy was so sophisticated. The music was so sophisticated. The celebrities that came on the show really drew in an adult audience as well. And all of it was so groundbreaking. I thought it was a great time to tell the story, particularly because in this country, and I think all over the world, society is in another upheaval. And it seems a very similar time to what brought us Sesame Street in the first place. It seems like a good time to remind everybody of these values that we all learned as a child.
And, maybe it's also slightly different, having watched it. I guess I was born in the 80s. So, watching it here in the UK, again, not realizing perhaps the significance of, when the show actually first came on the air in America, particularly things like the fact that it was really multi-ethnic, and like you say, not patronizing to children, kind of almost taking some of the humor from the adult Muppet shows and bringing, and the genres of music that it has. So, what do you think made it really stand out at that particular moment in time? And why is it so important for us to kind of realize that context?
I mean, I think what made it stand out was really the sophistication of the writing. The writers on the show came from the world of late night comedy, adult humor, and everyone had a mission never to talk down to kids. This was never anything but entertainment, pure and simple, as though it was for adults. And so it really shows in these Muppet segments, let's say. The humor is so sharp and so sophisticated. I think that even though sometimes it touched on things about race or social things or women, women's place in the world even. It was always in this package of superb comedy. I think it took a lot of chances that even today you wouldn't find on children's television. Things are a little more politically correct now, a little more safe, but Sesame Street in the first 20 years was completely experimental. Another thing I wanted to mention was the music. The Sesame Street band was composed of some of the most sought after session players in New York, people from the world of jazz and blues, really top shelf musicians. Everything that this show put in was of the highest caliber. And I think that has really translated through the generations. We look at it and we're surprised at the quality of what they brought to the table.
Yeah, I mean, when I was watching, the moments of like Johnny Cash, Stevie Wonder, and I was thinking, God, I mean, I'd want to go back and watch those episodes now as an adult. So it almost feels, even by today's standards, that's really astounding. And I guess that's why it's had such longevity.
Within the first couple of months of Sesame Street being on the air, even earlier than that, the agents that represented Hollywood superstar movie stars and superstar musicians and people from the world of sports and politicians even, they were knocking on the door asking to be guests on this show, a show that was created for 3 and 4-year-olds. This constantly blew my mind when I was making this movie, was to realize that all of these things, the mixed race cast, the sophisticated comedy, the Jesse Jackson coming on and leading these kids in a Black Power chant. You never see that on TV today. All of these things came to television in the form of a show for preschoolers. It's just amazing.
And it makes you realize, actually, in terms of how it can be relevant today, that a lot of those conversations about representation on screen are still coming up. When the character was Roosevelt Jr. that was introduced, and then there were kind of lots of parents writing in saying, well, actually, we don't want our Black kids to be represented as kind of a stereotype. So even, and that's a conversation that goes on today about, whether in terms of having multi-ethnic casts in films, or, is it something that we should point to and point out, or is it something that you should just, the representation is there? So, in some ways that conversation is still happening now.
Absolutely. When we were completing the film and getting it ready for its premiere at Sundance, the Black Lives Matter protests were going on full force. And it made me really understand that and appreciate the fact that we're almost in the same kind of moment that we were in when Sesame Street first came on the scene in 1969, when our society was filled with protests and the Vietnam War and all of these things were raging. It's a good reminder of these messages that shaped us as little kids. I think it's a wonderful moment to bring this film out, and I'm so grateful that we're able to, because it seems like the world is undergoing another reawakening, so to speak.
And what about the journey you went on as a filmmaker to make the documentary? Because obviously you'll have had to have gone through all the footage, all the archives, and do all these amazing interviews. So, how did you get everyone on board? And what was that process like for you? It must have been, education. I know you had the book to also base your research on, but what was that process like for you, doing all the research, doing all the interviews?
So in order to take this gigantic story, it's so massive, and boil it down in a way that would make it more concise and also very powerful, we decided as a group, we had many discussions, myself and the producers, but we brought it down to a very specific time frame, which was 1969 to basically 1990, 20 years. the most experimental period, the really the birth of the show. And also to really tell the story primarily through three characters: Joan Gans Cooney, who is this amazing woman who back in the 60s, when no woman was in any position of power in television, launched this show. Her story, the story of John Stone, who no one really knows who this man is. I think most people assume that Sesame Street was started by Jim Henson, because Jim Henson is the one we all know because of the Muppets. But it was actually John Stone who's behind so much of what Sesame Street was. So I really wanted to tell his story. He's sort of the emotional core. And the third character of this triumvirate, of course, is Jim Henson, who John Stone invited to come to the table, and he brought the Muppets, which really changed the game. And by telling the story primarily through these three people and keeping it in the 20-year time span, it at least gave a structure and a condensed place to begin. And I mean, honestly, I feel like this could have been maybe a series or a longer film. There was so many things that couldn't make it, but I think that we really tried to tell the story of not just Sesame Street, look at these funny moments, all of that, or much of it is available to look at on YouTube if you look for classic Sesame Street episodes. But I really wanted to tell the story of this band of geniuses, really, who were also activists, who got together to create something to reach Black and brown children in the inner city and give them the same educational opportunities that white kids in the suburbs were getting. And that was their mission. And that's why they created this set that looks like a street in Harlem. They wanted to present the world that these kids would recognize. And in the process, brought us something that none of us had ever seen before. It really did change the game and really did revolutionize television for everyone.
And certainly watching it, it sort of feels like, as much as it is about, you know, the show that they created, seeing all those behind the scenes, you know, moments, kind of the bits that go wrong, teasing each other, you know, like when they're playing Bert and Ernie. And you kind of think, you know, I think there's a comment towards the end that said, you know, it was their love for what they were doing and for each other that made the show such a success. And so I just feel like there's something else that comes out of the documentary of kind of realizing, you know, how amazing that is. And, you know, especially coming out of lockdown, no one's even working together in offices, you know, that we're kind of missing out on that bit. So, you know, do you think that that's something that really you drew out in the documentary?
You know, in the early stages of researching this film, I spoke to someone who said to me, you need to find a man named Victor DiNapoli. Victor DiNapoli, back in the early 80s, did a lot of filming on the set. And we did find the Victor DiNapoli footage. He shot maybe 14 hours of beautiful 16mm footage. He was part of the crew. He was an art director, and he had in mind to make a documentary about the back behind the scenes of Sesame Street. And so this beautiful footage exists. And that's what you're referring to. The people that were, say, Jim Henson and Frank Oz, you see them rehearsing, you see them working out a comedy skit. There's so many intimate moments, and everyone is so at ease because Victor, who's shooting, is one of them. He's from the crew. And he shot this footage over like a 3-year period, I think. And none of it, his documentary didn't happen. But how lucky am I that we were able to use that footage for this documentary and really have an intimate look at what was happening behind the scenes of this incredible show.
And I understand there was one person you weren't quite able to get on board, you know, in time to kind of feature in your documentary, which is Frank Oz. But he's since watched it, hasn't he? So, you know, what was that process like for you? And what was it like to kind of hear his response after seeing it?
It was very disappointing to me that for whatever reason, it didn't work out that he was able to be interviewed for the movie. But clearly, Frank Oz is a giant presence in this story. And he's so featured in the archival and so important to Sesame Street as a whole. So as soon as I had a rough cut, I wrote to him and I sent him a link, and I didn't hear back from him for weeks. And he did write back, and he said, I was a little afraid to look at this because I didn't think the story would be told in the way that was truthful and in a way that I would be proud of, but I loved what you did. And I've had many back and forths with him since. And that was one of the wonderful things, was hearing how much he loves this film.
And, you know, so the film touches on so many different things. In some ways, it's kind of just a tribute to the making of the show. In some ways, it's kind of like it brings out lots of themes that are relevant today, like we were mentioning, kind of like class issues and education and, you know, multi-ethnicity on the screen. But then it's also just a really enjoyable watch just to see like the artistry and the fun they had. So what do you hope people will take away from watching it?
You know, at the end of the day, I think that what people should, or what I hope people will take away, is the power of art and what it can do to really change our world. I made another documentary called Mad Hop Ballroom, which is about kids in New York City ballroom dancing, and it changes them into respectful gentlemen and ladies in a way, something that they initially hate. But that was also a story of the power of art, you know, and when you approach kids with important educational messages, but put it in a way that is entertaining and I don't know, sophisticated, really, not talking down to them, it really has a transformative effect on all of us, really. And I think that the power of something like Sesame Street, who took Muppets and animation and, you know, live action little sequences and amazing music, it brought us something that I think profoundly affected all of us around the world. Sesame Street's in, I believe, 150 countries. And there's an authenticity and a real love there that I think carries through. And it's creativity, you know, the power of creativity to do that, I think, is such an important thing to realize.
Well, I think I'm out of time, but can you quickly tell us what you might be working on next? If you've got another documentary and a film in the pipeline?
I have several documentaries in the pipeline, and I think all of them to some degree, mostly touch on the intersection of art and transformation. So I hope to be in production on several of them very soon. Amazing.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us. And I really can't wait for everyone else to get out and see this incredible documentary. So thanks so much for your time.
I'm so happy it's coming to the UK. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marilyn. Lovely to speak to you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.